Whatever you do in social protection, it has a very direct impact on either preventing poverty or getting people out of poverty. And that itself is quite meaningful. We also have in individual governments, in the ministries, our group of experts on social protection reform. And that gives us direct access on a day-to-day basis to communicate with high-level policymakers. In the morning, I never wake up in the morning and ask myself, why am I doing this?
Right.
No,
it's just
this
natural.
is in itself, it's rewarding, it's important.
ESCWApod, a series of interviews introducing you to ESCWA staff members and to the work they're doing in the Arab region. Hi, I'm Linda Tamim from the Communication Unit here at ESCWA. Thank you for joining us for this episode of ESCWApod, a podcast introducing you to our staff members and the work they're doing and how it's impacting communities in the Arab region. Today, I have the pleasure to host Marco Schaeffer, Senior Social Protection Officer and Chief of the Social Protection Section here at ESCWA. Welcome, Marco.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. So first of all, a very basic question. What is social protection?
So thanks for asking that, and I appreciate your interest in social protection. So let me start with the definition of social protection. So in ESCWA, the definition that we use is social protection is a set of public policies and programs intended to ensure at minimum a basic income security and access to basic healthcare throughout the life cycle. So let me break this down. I mean, it's important to understand, I think, that social protection is an umbrella term that consists of a number of very different policy approaches, very effective policy approaches. And if we try to see what's, let's say, the common denominator in that, I would say it's about managing risks around the life cycle, like getting sick, getting old, having children, and ensuring that people or populations do not fall into poverty because of that. So social insurances are a great tool to prevent falling into poverty. And that's why social insurances, social health insurance, pensions, but also child grants play a major role in social protection. This is the preventive function, But however, in social protection, there's also much more. For instance, when you're already poor. So countries in the region already introduced cash transfer for the poorest. That's for those who are chronic poor, who lack the assets or maybe who lack sufficient training to graduate out of poverty and into a more sustainable livelihoods. So that's a second function. That's a more promotive function.
Right.
However, as we also saw recently during the COVID-19 crisis, social protection mechanisms can have a huge impact during crisis, during shocks, like health shocks, but also the, let's say, energy, food price crisis shocks. These are situations where governments need to ensure that people do not fall into poverty, but also to stabilize economic production, consumption. And that has an economic, let's say, stabilizing function. And through this economic stabilizing function, it's also a political stabilizing function. So we do have a set of very different, let's say, motivations, objectives, and tools that all fall under this umbrella of social protection.
I mean, working at ESCWA, I'm sure that you work throughout the region, but you must be specifically really busy here in Lebanon, I assume.
We should.
Definitely. Now, how did you come to work in social protection, and how meaningful is the work for you, Marco?
Let me start with the second part of that question. How meaningful is it for me? And to be honest, it's quite meaningful, because whatever you do in social protection, it has a very direct impact on either preventing poverty or getting people out of poverty. And that itself is quite meaningful. And because we're doing it with governments, it has a large impact of large numbers of people. It's not just, let's say, an individual family. It's usually large segments of the population. Like, for instance, if you look into social insurance, unemployment insurance for informal or irregular workers in Egypt, that's millions of people.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in the morning, I never wake up in the morning and ask myself, why am I doing this?
Right.
No,
It's just
this
natural.
is in itself,
Absolutely.
it's rewarding, it's important, and that makes it really, I'm quite really excited working on it.
And how did you come to decide that you wanted to work in social protection?
It was not so much, let's say, a conscious decision that I really want to work in social protection. It was more like a gradual pathway. So I started my career, if I may speak of career, through research on HIV/AIDS, on impact of HIV/AIDS on societies in Southern Africa.
Yeah.
And if you look into that, you're very easily, or you also have to discuss issues of access to treatment.
Right.
And if you discuss access to treatment, you're already discussing something like health insurance. Who has health insurance? Who doesn't have health insurance?
Yeah.
And that was my starting point, research on these elements. And then I became a lecturer on health financing, researcher on health financing. And if you're discussing health financing, you're already very deep into social health insurance. And then it's just one more step into other aspects of social protection. Yeah.
Right.
So I went from becoming a lecturer to an advisor to the Ministry of Economic Development in Germany. And from there, I became a technical advisor for Germany's development cooperation in Indonesia, here advising Ministry of Social Affairs on introducing a large-scale social assistance program. So it was a gradual pathway that
and eventually you landed here at
Eventually
ESCWA.
here at ESCWA.
Now tell me a bit more about the challenges that you've been facing throughout your career, because you didn't just work at ESCWA, you worked, as you mentioned, in Indonesia, in Germany as well, since you're German.
Yeah. I mean, challenges, it matters a lot on what kind of perspective you take on that. No? From a government perspective, a huge challenge is how can we, let's say, provide social protection for those who do not yet have social protection, like irregular workers, informal workers, and that's a huge challenge. How can we make sure we identify them accurately? How can we make sure they are really enrolled and they are really in need for that? So that's a government perspective. For us now, let's say on the, let's say, policy advisory side, the challenge is how can we get into contact with governments? How can we play a crucial role? What is the best way to approach governments and provide the services, the advice, And I think a particular challenge is that lots of, let's say, policy decisions are frequently made already in certain circles, And if we are new, like in ESCWA is relatively new working on social protection, how do you get to that level into this kind of policy advice environment? And for us, the starting point frequently is to start with the technical aspects of implementing social protection.
Right.
So lots of governments have already laws in place, have regulations in place, but that doesn't mean that the implementation is already well on track. And here governments have lots of questions.
I was going to ask you, how's it going here in Lebanon, for instance?
So if I may say, we really need to start with the nitty-gritty details of implementation before we gain the trust and the credibility to move to the policy level. And that's the pathway that we take. We need to have the patience to work with governments really on details of implementation, and then we might migrate in the next, let's say, policy cycle also to policy advice.
That sounds really interesting, Marco. Now tell us a bit about the projects that you are currently working on.
So I have to make a difference. So there's two different kinds of, let's say, streams that we have. So one stream is, let's say, based on individual requests from member states. They have this issue, policy or implementation issue, and then we see, can we support them on this? Do we have the capacity? Do we have the skills? Can we find good solutions to that? And that is going to be then quite tailored, individual support around best practices, good practices. We try to break down, let's say, a larger issue or problem into individual policy or implementation bottlenecks, and then we try to find matching global good practices.
Yes.
So we'd like to create light bulb moments in the heads of our counterparts. Yeah. Oh, this is how Uruguay managed to identify very poor or irregular workers, and so on. And so that's one track. Yeah. Very individual, let's say, tailored support. The other track that we have is we already have certain, let's say, approaches and tools which we think make a lot of sense. For instance, a tool or an approach that we have developed, let's say, over the last couple of months is to develop a comprehensive template on social protection systems and reforms to establish comprehensive national country profiles on social protection. And that's an entry to discussing reform needs.
I was going to say, let's be a little specific here. Mm-hmm. How is working with ESCWA specifically helping you achieve a difference?
Well, honestly, I hope that I can help ESCWA to make a difference.
Of course, I'm sure you're an asset, Marco.
No, I mean, in ESCWA, it's really quite interesting, to be honest, because ESCWA has specific mandates, through its member states, through its regular parliamentary processes that establish mandates and recommendations, and that's already unique. However, we on the social protection side, we also have in the individual governments, in the ministries, our group of experts on social protection reform. And that gives us direct access on a day-to-day basis to communicate with high-level policymakers.
Yeah.
And that's quite unique. So it's a very direct access to decision makers. Either we can, let's say, address them jointly in one group or individually, or they can address us. They have direct access to us. So it's a mutual process. And that's very unique if we compare this also with, let's say, bilateral organizations or other multilateral organizations. I think our access and our mandates are quite unique and very helpful in providing the advice and the support.
For sure. So can you share perhaps a success story with us?
I think a great success story was, and that's in the context of what we call the issue-based coalition on social protection. So that's all the multilateral organizations, UNICEF, ILO, and so on. We are having this issue-based coalition on social protection. And towards the end of last year, when, let's say, the COVID-19 crisis was, let's say, still ongoing,
prominent.
We convened the ministers and high-level policymakers for the first ministerial forum on social protection policy. And I think that was super unique. It sets the scene, on addressing key policy issues in the region. The Arab countries are, so to speak, a frontier region in terms of social protection. Globally, we can say that, let's say, 45% of every household has access to one kind of social protection. Yeah. And 45% is not even a lot. Now compare the Arab region. The Arab region is, I think, 35% of each of all households.
That's not very high, is it?
That's super low, also in a global comparison. So by having this kind of, let's say, ministerial high-level discussion, we can really, I think we really kind of shaped the regional dialogue on what are key elements in terms of coverage, in terms of shock responsiveness, in terms of what are the financing needs, but also in terms of the governance of social protection systems and programs. So I think to convene this ministerial forum, that was quite an effort, but it was quite a worthwhile effort. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, the work you're doing is quite admirable, Marco. Now, if you were to give one message for people to keep, or perhaps a piece of advice for those who would like to pursue a career in social protection, what would it be?
I mean, first of all, who am I to give career advice? But
well, I mean, you're in the field and you're achieving quite a lot, so why not?
Inshallah. I mean, if I were to be giving an advice, I would say it should have two aspects. One is to really have the passion to change societies, or to change, let's say, how groups of the population are exposed to poverty and to risks, and that's one aspect. But it needs to be combined with a more granular knowledge and skills. So having a research background on, for just give an example, on what's the impact of social assistance or cash transfers on this or that group, or what motivates people or informal workers to sign up to a program. If you have this kind of research background in your CV, in your academic, let's say, formational years, that's a good starting point. And from then you can, let's say, migrate to more consultancy work. And once you're already in the consultancy area, then you're almost in the...
Then that's it.
Yes.
But one word that stuck with me is passion. You need to have passion in order to be successful in whatever it is that you're doing and you're planning on doing. So definitely have the passion for that, like yourself, Marco. And one bonus question to end this interview: what would you like to do once you retire?
Once I'm retired,
you still have some time.
Well, first I hope I do have some time, but honestly, I think I will make a very, very long vacation.
Well deserved.
No, I mean, at this stage, I don't have any concrete plans, but a long vacation is certainly on top of it.
Well deserved, Marco. Yeah. Thank you so much, Marco, for being with us today and for all the hard work that you're putting in. And thank you to our listeners and viewers for tuning in. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, and see you again next time.